Hello everyone, welcome to Horror Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos to relax, relieve stress, or even fall asleep. I think it would be great if you could leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from around the world. And if you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you won't miss any other videos on the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. You ever have one of those moments where reality just slips, where you see something and everything you thought you knew about the world suddenly feels like it's hanging by a thread? Yeah, that happened to me a while back, and I still get chills just thinking about it. It all started with a typical night shift at the warehouse. I was working for a big shipping company, the kind that handles freight, boxes, pallets of just about everything you could imagine. We had this massive, cavernous space filled with shelves that reached almost to the ceiling. Dim lights hung down, flickering like they were one power surge away from plunging us into darkness. The air was cold, almost unnaturally cold for what was supposed to be a climate-controlled space, and it always felt like a draft was moving in from somewhere, even though there weren't any open doors. It was one of those graveyard shifts, the kind where the clock seemed to be running backwards. The warehouse was almost empty that night, just me and a couple of the other guys. My buddy Dave was supposed to be working on the other side of the warehouse, packing up some delayed shipments. I remember that because he had complained about it earlier, something about how unfair it was that he always got the late night shift in the far corner. I was in my section, stacking some boxes, just trying to stay awake, when I saw him, or at least I thought I saw him. Dave was across the aisle from me, standing next to one of the pallets. He was facing away, wearing the same navy blue hoodie he always wore, hood up like usual. I thought it was weird, though, because he was supposed to be way on the other side. So I called out, "Hey Dave, thought you were working the east side tonight?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, perfectly still, back turned to me. It was strange. Dave wasn't the kind of guy to ignore anyone, especially not me. So I stepped closer, shoving my hands into my pockets because the air felt even colder as I approached. I could feel this tightness in my chest, like I was doing something I shouldn't. But I kept walking anyway, calling out again, "Dave, you good, man? You need help with something?" Still nothing. No movement, no sound. He was just standing there. Now at this point, I was maybe 10 feet away from him, and something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the way he was standing was wrong. His shoulders were too rigid, and there was no movement, no subtle breathing or shifting weight. Just a silhouette in the dim light, a shadow with the hood drawn low. I stopped. My gut told me not to get any closer. It felt like the air around me had thickened, and all I could hear was the hum of the lights overhead, a low electric buzz that seemed to grow louder and louder the longer I stood there. I remember thinking, why isn't he turning around? Something about it gnawed at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I decided enough was enough, so I shouted, "All right, man, quit messing around." My voice echoed, bouncing off the metal shelves and disappearing into the dark corners of the warehouse. Still, he didn't move, and by then, my anxiety was creeping into full-blown fear. I took a step back, and that's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I swear it was my name, just a whisper coming from somewhere close, too close. The kind of whisper that brushes against your ear and sends shivers down your spine. I spun around expecting to see Dave behind me, maybe trying to pull a prank, but there was no one there. Just row after row of towering shelves, stacked with silent, unmoving boxes. When I turned back, the figure was gone. I mean, completely gone. Not a trace, no footsteps, nothing. It was like he had just evaporated into thin air. My heart was pounding, and I felt this chill settle into my bones. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that I was tired, that the shadows were playing tricks on me. But it didn't feel like a trick. It felt real. I pulled out my radio and called for Dave. My voice cracked a little, and I hated that. I wanted to sound calm, but there was a tremor there I couldn't hide. "Hey Dave, where you at, man?" I waited, the static crackling in my ear. A moment later, Dave's voice came through, muffled but clear enough. "I'm in the East Wing, bro. Why?" He sounded confused, even a little annoyed, like he couldn't figure out why I was asking. My stomach dropped. He was on the opposite side of the warehouse, just like he was supposed to be. There was no way he could have made it across that fast, not without me seeing or hearing something. I tried to laugh it off, told him it was nothing, just me seeing things. But my hands were shaking, and I felt the hairs on my neck standing on end. I decided to head over to where Dave was, just to see him, to reassure myself that he was really there. As I made my way through the aisles, every creak of the shelves and every flicker of the lights seemed amplified, like the warehouse itself was watching me. I could feel my pulse in my ears, and my footsteps echoed, uneven and hesitant. When I finally found Dave, he was crouched down, taping up a box, just like he said he'd be. He looked up at me and frowned. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a laugh, but it came out weak. Yeah, I'm good. Just thought I saw you over on the west side. Guess I'm more tired than I thought." I didn't tell him everything, not then. I didn't want him to think I was losing it. But the look on his face told me he knew something was up. He stood up, dusting his hands off, and said, "You need a break? Let's go grab some coffee or something." We headed to the break room, and I tried to shake off the feeling, tried to convince myself it was all in my head. The break room was this cramped little space with a coffee pot that barely worked and a few mismatched chairs. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over everything. Dave poured us both a cup of coffee, and we sat there in silence for a bit. I could tell he wanted to ask what had really happened, but he didn't push, and I was grateful for that. But the night wasn't over. We still had a few hours left on our shift, and as much as I wanted to just stay in that break room, hiding from whatever I had seen, or thought I had seen, we had work to do. So we headed back out. Dave went back to the east wing, and I went back to my section, trying to convince myself that it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. Except as I approached my station, I noticed something. The pallet where I had seen Dave standing, it had been moved. Not by much, just a few inches, but enough that I could tell. I knew because I had placed it there myself earlier in the night, and I was particular about lining things up just right. There were scuff marks on the floor, like it had been dragged. My heart started pounding again, that cold feeling creeping back in. I looked around, the aisles stretching out in either direction, disappearing into shadow. The flickering lights made it hard to tell if something was moving just out of sight, or if it was just my mind playing tricks on me again. I took a deep breath and told myself to get a grip. But then I heard it again, that whisper. My name, soft and drawn out, like it was being spoken by someone who didn't quite know how to form the words. It came from behind me, and I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. There, at the far end of the aisle, I saw him again. The same figure, the same hoodie, standing perfectly still, just watching me. Only this time, he was facing me. I couldn't see his face. The hood was pulled too far forward, casting a shadow over his features. But I could feel his eyes on me, could feel the weight of his stare. My whole body went cold, and I felt rooted to the spot, like if I moved, something terrible would happen. The whisper came again, louder this time, echoing in my head, and I swear I could see his mouth moving under the hood, shaping the words. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was standing there, frozen in place, and the next I was sprinting down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the warehouse. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was following me. I just ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I reached the east wing where Dave was. He looked up, startled, as I came barreling around the corner, nearly crashing into a stack of boxes. Whoa! What the hell, man?" he shouted, grabbing my arm to steady me. I was breathing so hard I could barely get the words out, my chest heaving and my throat dry. "Dave, there's someone in the west wing." I managed to say, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. Dave's face shifted from concern to something closer to disbelief, and then to a wary curiosity. "What do you mean, someone? We're the only ones here tonight." He glanced over my shoulder towards the darkened aisles I had just come sprinting through. I shook my head, trying to make sense of what I had seen, but nothing seemed logical. "I don't know, man. I swear I saw you, or at least someone who looked just like you. But it wasn't you. It just stood there." My skin prickled with goosebumps just talking about it. Dave gave me a hard look, then sighed, his shoulders dropping a bit. Okay, let's go check it out. If someone's messing around in here, we need to know. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. I grabbed his arm, my grip tight. I'm serious, Dave. I don't think we should go back there. I couldn't explain the fear that had taken hold of me, but it was raw and visceral, like every instinct in my body was telling me to stay away. But Dave, being Dave, just shook his head. He was the practical one, always needing to see things for himself. Look, maybe it's some drunk who wandered in or some kid trying to prank us. We gotta check it out. He pulled his arm free from my grip and started walking towards the west wing. I didn't want to go. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay put, to get out of that warehouse altogether. But leaving Dave to go alone didn't feel right either. So, despite the dread clawing at me, I followed. The walk back to the west side felt endless. The air seemed colder, and the shadows deeper. Every little creak or clank made me jump, my eyes darting to every dark corner. Dave, on the other hand, moved with steady determination, shining his flashlight into the aisles as we walked. When we reached the spot where I had seen the figure, everything looked normal, at least at first glance. The pallet was still there, slightly shifted, just as I had noticed before. Dave knelt down, inspecting the scuff marks on the floor. He frowned. Yeah, something moved this. All right, he muttered, running his hand along the edge of the pallet. I stood a few feet behind him, my eyes scanning the area, every muscle in my body tensed. I half expected the figure to reappear, to see it standing silently at the end of the aisle, watching us. But there was nothing. Just the flickering lights, the stacks of boxes, and the unending aisles stretching into darkness. Then Dave stood up, dusting his hands off on his jeans. See, man? There's nothing here now. Probably just some kids. We should double-check the doors, make sure they're all locked. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something inside me wouldn't let go of the fear, the certainty that whatever I had seen wasn't just some prank. I opened my mouth to argue, to try to make him understand, but before I could say anything, we both heard it. The sound of a box falling, the sharp crash echoing through the warehouse. Dave and I exchanged a glance, and I saw the tension in his eyes now, the realization that maybe this wasn't as simple as he had thought. We turned towards the noise, Dave raising his flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows. At the far end of the aisle, we saw it. A box lying on the ground, its contents spilled across the floor. And standing beside it, partially obscured by the shadows, was the figure. The hood still up, its face still hidden. But this time, there was movement. A slight, almost imperceptible tilt of the head, as if it was acknowledging us. Hey, who are you? Dave shouted, his voice strong but with an edge of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. He took a step forward, and I instinctively grabbed his arm again. Don't, I whispered. My voice was barely audible, the fear making it hard to speak. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there watching us. Dave hesitated, then took another step, pulling free of my grip. The flashlight flickered, just for a moment, but in that split second of darkness, the figure disappeared. Gone. Dave swung the beam around, trying to find it, but there was nothing. Just the box on the floor and the cold, empty air. Did you see that? Dave muttered, his voice finally betraying the fear I knew he must be feeling. He turned to look at me, and for a moment, I saw my own terror reflected in his eyes. He knew now. Whatever was in this warehouse wasn't just a prank or some random intruder. It was something else, something we couldn't understand. We need to get out of here, I said, my voice breaking. Now. Dave didn't argue this time. He nodded, and we started backing away, slowly at first, then faster, until we were almost running. The warehouse seemed to close in around us, the aisles narrowing, the shadows growing darker and deeper with every step. I could feel something behind us, could feel the weight of eyes on my back, the air growing colder and colder. We finally burst through the door into the break room, slamming it shut behind us. I locked it, my hands shaking so badly it took me a couple of tries to get the latch secured. Dave was breathing hard, his face pale, the flashlight still clutched in his hand. For a few moments we just stood there, staring at the door, waiting, half expecting it to burst open. But nothing happened. The warehouse was silent, the only sound our ragged breathing and the hum of the vending machine in the corner. Dave sank into one of the chairs, running a hand through his hair. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, finally voicing the question that had been screaming in my mind. I didn't have an answer. I didn't think there was one. All I knew was that whatever I had seen, whatever we had seen, wasn't something that belonged in our world. We stayed in that break room until our shift ended, neither of us willing to go back out there. When the morning crew came in, we didn't say much. Just mumbled something about not feeling well and left as quickly as we could. That was the last night shift I ever worked at that warehouse. I put in my notice the next day. Dave stuck around a little longer, but he avoided the night shifts after that too. We didn't talk about it much. There wasn't really anything to say. How do you explain something like that to someone who wasn't there, who didn't feel the cold, or hear the whisper of their own name coming from the darkness? Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Dave had kept walking towards that figure. If the flashlight hadn't flickered, if we had seen what was really under that hood. But then I remember the feeling I had when I stood there, the sense that I was standing on the edge of something terrible, something I wasn't supposed to see, and I'm just glad we never found out. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can hear it, the soft whisper of my name just beyond the edge of hearing, like a memory that won't quite fade. And every time I feel that same cold chill, that same sense of being watched by something that doesn't belong. I've tried to move on, to tell myself it was just exhaustion, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. I know that what I saw was real. And sometimes late at night, I wonder if it's still there, standing in the shadows of that warehouse, waiting for someone else to see it, to hear that whisper and feel that terrible freezing cold. And I hope, for their sake, that they run. You know, sometimes I think back on that camping trip to the Great Smoky Mountains, and I wish I could forget it. There's something about being alone in nature that's supposed to be comforting, like a break from everything that overwhelms you in life. But that weekend, alone by the river, taught me something different. Sometimes when you think you're alone, you're really anything but. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me, my tent, and the open air. I had taken a few days off from work, hoping to get some peace and quiet. The Great Smoky Mountains had always been on my list, and I knew a spot along the river, a place I'd read about online, remote, far from the usual campgrounds with their RVs and noisy campers. It was the kind of place where, when the sun went down, it was pitch dark except for your campfire and the stars above. The hike to the spot was perfect. It was just the kind of secluded I was looking for. No other hikers on the trail, no sign of civilization for miles. I got there late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, sending a warm orange glow through the thick forest. The river ran slow and steady, the water a cool, comforting gurgle that almost made me forget all the noise of my life back home. I set up my tent on a flat stretch of ground near the riverbank, gathered some wood, and got a fire going. By the time the stars were out, I had cooked myself a little dinner, and everything felt peaceful. The air was crisp, the smell of pine mixing with the smoky warmth of the fire. The wind whispered through the trees, and I remember thinking it was the perfect sound to fall asleep to. That was before I saw him. It must have been around 9 or 10 when I first noticed something, a shift in the atmosphere. It's hard to explain, but it was like a sudden awareness that I wasn't alone. I looked up, and across the fire, maybe 20 feet away, there he was. A man, standing perfectly still, watching me. He wasn't close enough for me to see his features clearly, but I could make out his outline in the dim light of the fire. He was tall, with a dark coat and a hat that cast a shadow over his face. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sound. He just stood there, staring. My first instinct was to call out, "Hey, can I help you?" But the words got caught in my throat. There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. He wasn't moving, and he wasn't making any sign of acknowledging me, which was strange enough. But it was the stillness of his body that really got to me. He was too still, like he wasn't even breathing. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just another camper, someone who'd lost their way and found my fire. But something in my gut told me otherwise. I tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth, but I could feel his eyes on me. It was like his stare was a physical thing, pressing against my skin. Minutes went by, and he didn't move. I glanced over at him, trying to get a better look, but the shadows from the trees made it hard to see. I could tell his head was angled slightly, as if he were curious. But still, he made no sound, no attempt to communicate. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, trying to look confident, though my legs felt shaky beneath me. "Hey, you need something?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. He didn't even flinch, just stared. My fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks into the sky, and for a moment, I thought I saw his face. Just a glimpse, pale and expressionless, with eyes that seemed far too dark for the firelight. But then the sparks died down, and his face was hidden again in the shadow of his hat. I decided to pretend like I wasn't rattled, even though every instinct was telling me to pack up and leave. I slowly sat back down, staring into the flames, trying to ignore him. I wanted to believe he'd eventually get bored and wander off, that it was all some weird misunderstanding. But he stayed. I watched as he moved then, slow, deliberate movements. He turned away from the fire and went down towards the riverbank. The whole time, he was silent, his footsteps barely a whisper against the ground. He crouched down, right at the edge of the water, and started doing something I couldn't quite make out. I squinted, leaning forward to see better, but all I could make out was that he was working with something. A pile of sticks, maybe? After a few minutes, I realized he was building a small raft, weaving branches and tying them together with strips of something that looked like fabric. He worked with a calm precision that was almost mesmerizing. And then, without warning, he placed the little raft into the water. It floated there, bobbing gently on the current, and he just watched it, his head tilted slightly, the same way he had been looking at me. I don't know why, but something about that made my stomach turn. There was something ritualistic about it, something deliberate. I didn't realize how tightly I was gripping my knees until my fingers started to hurt. I wanted to say something, to yell at him to stop, to ask what the hell he was doing, but I couldn't find my voice. Instead, I just sat there, staring as the little raft drifted away down the river, disappearing into the darkness. After that, he stood up and looked back at me. For a long moment, he just stood there, like he was waiting for something. Maybe for me to react, maybe for something else entirely. And then, as silently as he'd come, he turned and walked into the forest, his dark shape melting into the trees until there was nothing left but the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the river. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined him standing there, just beyond the light, watching me. I kept expecting to hear his footsteps again, to see that dark silhouette at the edge of the fire. But the night passed slowly, the darkness stretching on, and he never came back. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I had made up my mind. I was getting out of there. I packed my things in a rush, my hands shaking, glancing around every few seconds, half expecting to see that strange figure appear again, his head tilted, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The hike back was brutal. I'd been too tense to sleep, and exhaustion pulled at me with every step. But worse than the tiredness was the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was that same sensation from the night before, the prickling awareness of eyes on me. I kept turning, looking behind me, but there was nothing there. Just the endless stretch of trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the events of the night before had freaked me out more than I wanted to admit. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that he was still out there somewhere, just out of sight. The trail twisted and turned, leading me higher up the ridge before finally dipping back down towards where I'd parked my car. It should have been a relief to see the clearing through the trees, to see my car right where I'd left it. But as I stepped into the clearing, I froze. There, resting on the hood of my car, was a small raft, just like the one he'd made the night before. Sticks tied together with strips of fabric, the whole thing soaked through, as if it had been plucked straight from the river and left there for me to find. My breath caught in my throat, and for a long moment I couldn't move. The air felt colder, the clearing suddenly too quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I glanced around, my eyes darting from tree to tree, but there was no sign of him. Just the raft and the silent woods and the terrible certainty that I had been right. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the raft, my hands trembling, and hurled it into the bushes. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want it near me. I jumped into my car, my heart pounding, and I drove out of there as fast as I could, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped away from that cursed place. Even now, weeks later, I can't get that night out of my head. I keep seeing his silhouette in the shadows, keep hearing the sound of the river, that soft, gentle gurgle that no longer feels comforting. I still don't know who he was, or what he wanted, or why he left that raft for me. But I know one thing for sure, whatever he wasn't just some lost camper. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear something outside my window, the soft rustle of leaves, the faint whisper of the wind. And sometimes, late at night, I think I hear something outside my window, the soft rustle of leaves, the faint whisper of the wind. And every now and then, there's a feeling, an almost primal awareness, that draws my attention to the darkness beyond the glass. I try to ignore it, to convince myself it's just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But it's always there, that creeping sensation that someone or something is watching. Last night, it happened again. I had gone to bed early, hoping for a good night's rest, trying to put all my thoughts of that camping trip behind me. I was almost asleep when I heard it, a soft sound, like something brushing against the side of the house. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding, listening. There it was again, a scrape, a soft tap, as if something, or someone, was moving just outside. I knew I shouldn't, but I had to see. I slowly pulled myself out of bed, my legs shaky, the floor cold under my feet. I crept over to the window, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and pulled the curtain back, just a little. The moonlight cast a pale glow over my backyard, illuminating the trees that bordered my property. For a moment, everything seemed quiet, peaceful even. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, trying to steady my heart. Maybe it was just a branch swaying in the wind, or maybe a raccoon rummaging around. But then I saw it, right at the edge of the trees, a figure standing perfectly still, half hidden in the shadows. My breath caught, and I felt my stomach lurch. It was him. I knew it, even though I couldn't see his face. He was there, just watching. The hat, the dark coat, the same unsettling stillness. I blinked, hoping it was some kind of hallucination, some leftover fear manifesting itself. But when I opened my eyes again, he was still there. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I grabbed my phone, fumbling with it, trying to turn on the flashlight. When the light finally flicked on, I pointed it towards the window, the bright beam reflecting off the glass. But when I looked again, he was gone. The backyard was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind, nothing out of place. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination. I tried to believe it was all just some kind of leftover paranoia. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had seen him just as clearly as I'd seen him by the fire that night, just as clearly as I'd seen that raft on the hood of my car. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in my living room, the lights on, every creak of the house making me jump. I kept glancing towards the windows, half expecting to see his silhouette reappear, to see him watching me with that same unnerving stillness. But the night passed, and nothing happened. This morning I went outside, my body still tense with exhaustion and anxiety. The air was crisp, the morning light streaming through the trees, birds chirping like nothing was wrong. But as I stepped into the backyard, I felt my stomach drop. There, resting on my back porch, was another raft. It was smaller this time, just a few sticks tied together, but there was no mistaking it. I stared at it, my whole body going numb, the world around me blurring out. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to go near it, but I couldn't just leave it there. I grabbed a stick and poked at it, flipping it over, and that's when I saw the note. A small piece of paper, tucked between the sticks, damp from the morning dew. I used the stick to pull it out, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of it. The paper was yellowed and crumpled, the ink smeared from the moisture, but I could still make out the words, 2 words, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Come back. My heart felt like it stopped, the words echoing in my head, a chill running down my spine. I dropped the paper, stepping back, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think about what it meant or what he wanted. But the message was clear. He was waiting for me. He wanted me to return to that river, to that clearing in the woods. I went back inside, locked the door, and called the police. I told them there was someone trespassing, someone who had left something on my property. They came by, took a report, even looked around, but of course, they found nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone near the house. Just that little raft sitting on my porch like some twisted invitation. They left, telling me to call if anything else happened, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They thought it was just a prank, maybe a kid in the neighborhood messing around. But I knew better. I knew it was him. And I knew that if I stayed, if I ignored his message, he'd keep coming back. So here I am now, packing a bag, my hands trembling with every item I throw inside. I don't know where I'm going, but I know I can't stay here. I need to get away, as far away as possible. Maybe it won't matter. Maybe he'll find me anyway. But I have to try. I keep telling myself that I'm overreacting, that it's all in my head. But then I remember the way he looked at me, the way he moved without a sound, the raft drifting away down the river, and I know that whatever he is, he's not going to stop. Not until I do what he wants. Not until I go back. And that's the part that scares me the most, because I don't know what will happen if I do. I don't know what he wants from me, or why he chose me. But the thought of going back to that river, of standing there again, alone in the dark, with him watching, it makes my blood run cold. I don't know if I'll ever be able to outrun him, if there's anywhere I can go that he won't find me. But I have to try. I have to believe that somewhere out there, there's a place where he can't reach me, where the whispers in the dark will finally stop. Until then, I just have to keep moving, keep running, and hope that one day I'll wake up and this will all be over. That one day I'll look out my window and there won't be anyone there. No figure standing in the shadows, no rafts left as messages, but until then, I'll keep running. Because I know deep down that if I stop, if I let him catch up, there'll be no escape. And that's a risk I'm not willing to take. Not now, not ever. It was early spring 2016, just after my 24th birthday, when my friend Brad and I decided to escape the noise of the city and retreat to our usual camping spot, Black Canyon Rim Campgrounds, nestled near the majestic peaks of the Rockies. The campsite was surrounded by tall pine trees, offering a breathtaking view of the mountains in the distance. The air was filled with the sweet scent of pine and the melodious chirping of birds. It was our sanctuary, a place we visited 2 or 3 times a year, always a couple of hours' drive away, making it the perfect weekend getaway. As we drove down the narrow dirt road leading to the campground, I felt the tension of city life slip away. The sign at the start of the road informed us about local wildlife and fire warnings, setting a rustic mood. The road was mostly straight with just one split, and we once even ventured down the longer path just to see where it led. One route took us to a ranger tower, the other ended in a dead end, swallowed by thick forest. This time, as we parked the car and unloaded our gear, I felt a strange sense of foreboding wash over me. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the sheer isolation of the place. We set up our tents, excited to immerse ourselves in the tranquility that surrounded us. The towering trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced along the ground. As dusk settled, we gathered around the campfire, the flickering flames illuminating our faces. Brad and I exchanged stories, our laughter mingling with the crackling of the fire. But as the night deepened, an unease settled in my chest, a gnawing feeling I couldn't quite shake. After a while, we decided to call it a night. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I could hear the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and the soft whispers of the wind. I lay back down on the pillow, trying to relax, but a sudden wave of fear washed over me. I felt an inexplicable sensation, like someone was watching me. I glanced at the tent's entrance, which was securely zipped, but a chill crept up my spine. Just then, I noticed a glint of light reflecting off something outside. My heart raced as I listened closely, hoping to hear nothing unusual. But then I saw it, a hand outside, slowly pulling the entrance open. The hand was holding something shiny, but I couldn't make out what it was. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of an old-fashioned camera shutter clicking repeatedly. It was a sound I hadn't heard in years, reminiscent of my grandfather taking family photos. The memories flooded back, but now that comforting thought was tainted by fear. "What the hell?" I whispered to myself, my throat dry. I wanted to scream out to Brad, but my voice felt trapped. Time seemed to stretch as I finally opened my mouth to yell, "Brad!" At that moment, the figure outside recoiled, climbing down quickly. In the moonlight, I caught a glimpse of a very unique ring on their left hand. It was wooden and had a strange marking on one side, but I didn't get a good look before they vanished into the darkness. Brad, alerted by my scream, rushed outside. I could hear the thud of his footsteps as he called out into the night, but all he found was the empty street and the fading sound of footsteps in the distance. We barely slept that night, our minds racing with fear. Every rustle of the wind sent shivers down my spine, and I felt anxious every time the branches tapped against the tent. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching, waiting. As soon as dawn broke, we packed our things and hurriedly checked out of the campground. Claunt and Jeanette, our other friends, were already at the car, oblivious to the terror we had just experienced. Brad and I returned the keys to the lockbox, exchanging worried glances. Later, I reported the incident to the host. He seemed genuinely sorry, but told me there was nothing he could do. "This is a quiet area," he said nonchalantly. "It's probably just a prank." But I felt uneasy about his dismissive attitude. Brad speculated it might have been the host himself, a theory I found troubling. Claunt chimed in, suggesting that the locals were rich snobs who didn't care about outsiders, and maybe we'd never know who had tried to break in. The creepiest part lingered in my mind. Someone might have a photo of me lying in my sleeping bag, and I had no idea who that someone was. A few days passed, and our minds continued to replay that haunting night. Brad suggested we return to the campground to confront whatever it was that lurked in the shadows, but I hesitated. "What if it wasn't just a prank?" I countered, the memory of that ring still vivid in my mind. Against my better judgment, curiosity got the best of me. "Let's go back, Brad. We need closure." So we returned to Black Canyon Rim, my heart pounding with each turn of the dirt road. The familiar sights filled me with a mix of nostalgia and dread. The trees loomed taller, casting longer shadows that seemed to reach out for us as we parked the car. The atmosphere was thick with tension as we approached the camping area. Everything looked the same, yet somehow different. I felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to disturb its silence. As we set up our tent, the air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness enveloped us. After a few hours, we gathered around the fire, trying to shake off the chill that settled in our bones. But then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere shifted again. I felt that familiar sensation of being watched. My eyes darted to the woods, where shadows danced ominously. "Did you hear that?" I asked Brad, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, eyes wide. It sounded like footsteps. The clicking noise returned, echoing through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. "It's happening again," I murmured, gripping the edge of my seat. Suddenly, the light from our fire flickered as a gust of wind swept through, casting long, eerie shadows around us. We exchanged worried glances, fear palpable between us. "Let's check it out," Brad suggested, but a part of me wanted to run. Together, we moved toward the darkness beyond the firelight, hearts racing. As we stepped into the woods, the atmosphere changed. The air felt thick and heavy, and every crackle of twigs beneath our feet echoed like thunder in the stillness. "Stay close," Brad whispered, his voice tense. As we ventured deeper, the sound of the clicking grew louder, echoing around us like a sinister heartbeat. My breath quickened as I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon us. "Do you see anything?" I asked, peering into the shadows. "No," he replied, but I could see the fear mirrored in his eyes. Suddenly, we spotted a flash of movement ahead, a figure darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" I gasped, adrenaline surging through me. "Yeah," Brad breathed, his face pale. "We need to go back." But before we could turn, the figure emerged from the shadows, illuminated by the faint moonlight. It was a woman, her long hair cascading around her shoulders. In one hand she held a camera, and on her left hand I recognized the wooden ring with its peculiar marking. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. She smiled eerily, the moonlight catching her eyes, making them glimmer with an unsettling brightness. "I've been waiting for you," she said softly, the clicking of the camera shutter echoing around us. My heart raced as I took a step back. "What do you want?" "Just a picture," she replied, raising the camera as if to snap a shot. Before I could react, Brad shouted, "Run!" and we bolted, stumbling over roots and fallen branches, the sound of the clicking shutter haunting us in the darkness. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of our car. Panting, we locked the doors, our hearts racing as we glanced at each other in disbelief. "What just happened?" Brad gasped. "I don't know," I replied, shaking, "but I think she had a photo of me from before." We drove away from Black Canyon Rim, the haunting images of that night forever etched in my memory. The feeling of being watched lingered long after we left, and I couldn't shake the dread that someone was still following us, carrying secrets we were never meant to uncover. You know, I've always loved camping alone. There's just something about being out in nature, no other people around, no distractions, just me, the trees, and the open sky. It's kind of my way of resetting, of getting away from everything and finding some peace. But this one trip, man, this trip was different, and not in a good way. It was supposed to be a special experience, something I hadn't done before. I decided to head out to this little island, just a short boat ride from the coast. I'd heard about it from a guy I met at a hiking gear shop, a secluded place, uninhabited, with thick woods and a beautiful rocky shoreline. It sounded perfect. I packed my tent, a few supplies, and my best companion, Spoonie, my Labrador retriever. Spoonie's always been with me on my adventures, always by my side, his goofy grin and wagging tail my constant comfort. The day started off fine. We took a small boat to the island, just me and Spoonie, the breeze in our faces as we cut through the water. Spoonie was excited, his head hanging over the side of the boat, barking at the waves as if he could chase them. When we arrived, the island looked just like I'd imagined, wild and untouched, with dense trees that formed a dark green wall along the shoreline. There was something enchanting about it, the kind of place where you could truly feel like you were alone in the world. We found a good spot to set up camp, a flat patch of land near a rocky outcrop. It overlooked a small cliff that dropped off to the ocean below, the waves crashing against the rocks, sending up spray. I pitched the tent, got a fire going, and we settled in for what I thought was going to be a quiet evening. But it didn't take long for things to feel off. It started with Spoonie. Normally he's a happy, carefree dog. He'll run around sniffing things, chasing birds, and always staying close by. But that day, something was different. From the moment we got there, Spoonie was on edge. He kept staring up towards the cliffs, his ears perked, his body tense. He even barked a few times, short, sharp barks, not his usual excited barking. More like a warning. I tried to calm him down, telling him, "Hey, Spoonie, it's just the wind, buddy, relax." But he wouldn't stop. He kept pacing back and forth, staring at the cliffs. I walked over, looked up to see what was bothering him, but there was nothing there. Just rocks and shadows. It was strange, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just getting used to the new place. The sun started setting, casting long shadows across the island, and a chill settled in. I made some dinner, sharing bits with Spoonie, trying to enjoy the quiet. But I could feel that unease, that sense that something wasn't quite right. The wind was picking up, rustling the leaves in the trees, and there was this sound. It almost sounded like whispering. At first I thought it was just the wind blowing through the cracks in the rocks, but it was persistent. A faint, almost rhythmic whisper, like a voice just on the edge of hearing. I glanced around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but there was nothing, just the wind and the sound of the waves crashing below. Spoonie was still restless, his eyes darting from the cliff to the tree line, his ears twitching at every sound. By the time the sky had turned black and the stars were out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Spoonie sat beside me by the fire, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the light of the flames. His body was rigid, his eyes wide, and that's when I saw it, just for a moment, something reflecting in the dark. 2 points of light, like eyes, staring at us from beyond the firelight. I blinked, and they were gone, swallowed by the shadows. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal, I thought, a raccoon or a deer, but it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate, like something or someone was watching. I decided to turn in early, hoping that getting inside the tent would help calm both me and Spoonie down. I zipped up the tent, Spoonie lying at my feet, his body still tense, ears up. I turned off my flashlight, the darkness swallowing us whole, with only the soft flicker of the dying fire outside casting shadows on the tent walls. I was just about to drift off when Spoonie started growling. Low, almost a rumble, deep in his throat. It was the kind of growl I'd never heard from him before, protective, warning, scared. My eyes shot open and I strained my ears listening. There was something moving outside the tent, footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching softly against the earth, circling us. My heart began to pound, every beat echoing in my ears. Spoonie stood up, his body rigid, and started barking, loud, frantic barks that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking, and unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, and for a second, I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the light. Tall, motionless, with its head tilted slightly as if it was curious. It was shaped like a person, but something was wrong. The way it stood, the way it seemed to blend into the shadows, it wasn't right. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Spoonie was barking like crazy now, his hackles raised, and I felt that primal, instinctual fear clawing at me. I fumbled with the flashlight, the beam shaking as I tried to keep it steady. And then, just like that, the figure was gone. One moment it was there, and the next, nothing. Only darkness, the wind, and the sound of Spoonie's frantic barking. I zipped the tent back up, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, the tent suddenly feeling like a flimsy barrier against whatever was out there. Spoonie was still growling, his eyes locked on the tent wall, as if he could see something I couldn't. I spent the rest of the night sitting up, the flashlight clutched in my hand, my ears straining for any sound. The footsteps never came back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That whatever I had seen was still out there, just beyond the edge of the firelight, waiting. When the first light of dawn finally started to creep through the trees, I didn't waste any time. I packed up camp in a rush, my eyes constantly scanning the tree line, Spoonie sticking close to my side. The unease was still there, that deep-seated feeling that we weren't alone, that someone or something was watching us. We made our way back to the boat, the island eerily silent. Even the birds seemed to be keeping their distance, the air heavy and still. Spoonie kept glancing back, his ears flat, and I couldn't help but do the same, half expecting to see that figure standing there, watching us leave. But there was nothing, only the shadows among the trees, shifting with the breeze. As we pushed off from the shore, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief to be leaving, to put distance between us in that place. But dread, because I knew that whatever I had seen wasn't something I could easily forget. As the island grew smaller behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were still there, hidden among the trees, watching us leave. When we finally reached the mainland, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Spoonie seemed to feel it too. He relaxed, his tail wagging slightly for the first time since we'd arrived on that island. I loaded our gear into the car, gave Spoonie a reassuring pat, and drove away, determined to put as much distance between us and that place as possible. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the memory of those eyes, the way they seemed to pierce through the darkness, locking onto me. I still don't know what it was, who it was, that watched us from the shadows. I've tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I was tired, or maybe it was just an animal. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Sometimes at night, I'll wake up to the sound of Spoonie growling, his eyes fixed on the window, his body tense. I'll lie there, my heart pounding, straining my ears for any sound, any hint of movement outside. And every now and then, just for a moment, I think I hear it. The faint crunch of footsteps, the whisper of something moving just beyond the edge of the light. And I can only hope that it stays away. But I know better. There's a part of me that can't shake the sense that whatever it was, it's not finished with me yet. It's been a few weeks since the island, and I've tried to get back to my normal routine. But there's something about those nights on the island that won't let go of me. Spoonie feels it too. He used to love curling up by the back door to sleep, but now he avoids it, always finding somewhere more hidden to settle down. He seems to watch the windows like a guard on duty, his ears constantly perked, waiting for a sound, a movement that never comes. A couple of nights ago, it happened again. I was in the living room, trying to relax, watching TV while Spoonie lay on the rug beside me. Everything seemed normal, until Spoonie suddenly lifted his head, his ears straight up, his body tense. He started to growl, that low, deep rumble that I'd only heard on the island. My blood ran cold instantly. It was that same feeling, that creeping dread, the sense that there was something just outside my view, something that shouldn't be there. I turned the volume down on the TV, straining my ears to listen. At first there was nothing, just the silence of the house, the occasional hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But then I heard it, a soft rustling, like leaves brushing against each other. It was coming from outside the window, faint, barely audible. My heart began to pound in my chest. I wanted to tell myself it was the wind, maybe a stray branch scraping against the siding. But that didn't make sense. The night was calm, and there were no trees close enough to touch the house. Spoonie got to his feet, his growl deepening, and moved towards the window, his eyes fixed on something beyond the glass. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Slowly I got up and followed him, my feet feeling heavy, like they didn't want to take me any closer to whatever was out there. I flicked on the porch light, the bulb buzzing to life and casting a pool of pale yellow light over the yard. For a moment, I didn't see anything, just the empty yard, the grass swaying slightly in the night breeze. But then I saw it, at the edge of the light, just beyond where the glow faded into darkness. A figure, tall, still, standing just out of reach of the light. It was exactly like the one on the island, the dark coat, the hat pulled low, the same unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest so hard I could barely hear anything else. Spoonie barked, loud and sharp, the sound echoing through the room, and I saw the figure shift, just a little. Slowly it turned, disappearing into the darkness beyond the light. I rushed to the door, locking it, my hands trembling. Spoonie was still growling, his eyes locked on the window, even though the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound made me jump, every creak of the house sent a jolt of fear through me. I sat on the couch, Spoonie lying beside me, his head on my lap, his ears twitching at every noise. I kept the lights on, the curtains closed, trying to convince myself that the figure wasn't real, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But I knew it was real. I'd seen it. Spoonie had seen it. And whatever it was, it had followed us back from the island. The next day I decided to do something about it. I didn't know what exactly, but I had to try to figure out what was happening. I drove back to the gear shop where I'd first heard about the island, hoping to talk to the guy who'd mentioned it. Maybe he knew something. Maybe there was a story, some kind of legend I hadn't heard. Something that could explain what I'd seen. The shop was quiet when I got there, the bells above the door chiming softly as I stepped inside. The guy was behind the counter, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He looked up, giving me a nod. "Hey there, need some gear?" I shook my head, trying to find the right words. "Actually, I was hoping to ask you something. It's about that island. You mentioned it to me a few weeks back. I camped there, and I hesitated, the memory of those glowing eyes flashing through my mind. Something happened." His expression changed. The friendly smile faded, replaced by a frown. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the counter. "The island?" he said, his voice lower now, more serious. "You actually went out there?" I nodded, feeling a cold chill settle into my stomach. He shook his head slowly, sighing. "I shouldn't have mentioned it. Most people don't go near that place. It's got a reputation, you know." "What kind of reputation?" I asked, my throat feeling dry. He glanced around as if to make sure no one else was listening. The shop was empty, but he still spoke in a hushed tone. Locals call it the Watcher's Island. There are stories, old ones, about people seeing things out there. Figures in the woods, things that don't belong. They say it watches people, anyone who stays there too long. Some folks say they've seen it follow them home. He paused, his eyes locking onto mine, his expression grim. I thought it was just stories. Didn't think anyone would actually go out there. My mouth felt dry, my heart pounding. So what do I do now? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. How do I get rid of it? He was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head. I don't know, he said, his voice filled with regret. Nobody really knows. Some say you have to go back, make peace with it somehow. Others say you have to stay away, never go near it again. He looked at me, his eyes filled with an unsettling sympathy. Whatever you do, just be careful. It doesn't like to be seen. I left the shop feeling more lost than before, the man's words echoing in my mind. Make peace with it? How was I supposed to do that? And the idea of going back, of returning to that island, of facing whatever was out there, it filled me with a deep, bone-chilling fear. That night I sat in my living room, Spoonie by my side, the curtains drawn tight, every light in the house on. I thought about what the man had said, about the stories, the warnings. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for those eyes to appear again. I had to do something. Spoonie shifted beside me, his ears perking up, a soft growl rumbling in his throat. My heart skipped a beat, my breath catching in my chest. I turned my head slowly, my eyes darting to the window. For a moment, everything was still. Then I saw it. A shadow, shifting just beyond the curtain, a soft rustle, like something brushing against the glass. I stood up, my hands trembling, and moved to the window. Slowly, I pulled the curtain back, my heart pounding in my ears. There, at the edge of the yard, I saw it again. The figure, standing perfectly still, watching me. Its head tilted, as if curious, as if waiting. And that's when I knew. There was no running from this, no escaping it. It had followed me, and it wasn't going to leave until I faced it, until I went back. I turned away from the window, my decision made. I didn't know if it would work, didn't know if it was the right choice, but I had to try. I had to go back to that island, to face whatever was waiting for me there, and hope that somehow I could put an end to this. Spoonie let out a soft whine, his eyes following me as I moved to pack a bag. I knelt down, giving him a gentle scratch behind the ears, trying to calm the fear that was swirling inside me. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "We're gonna end this." I didn't know what would happen when I got there, didn't know if I'd even make it back. But one thing was certain, I couldn't keep living like this, in fear, always waiting for those eyes to appear in the dark. So here I am now, sitting in my car, Spoonie beside me, the island just a short boat ride away. The sky is overcast, the wind picking up, the waves crashing against the shore with a sense of urgency, almost like they're warning me to stay away. But I can't. Not anymore. I take a deep breath, my hands tightening on the wheel. It's time to finish what started that night, time to face whatever's waiting for me on that island. And as much as it terrifies me, I know that this is the only way. Spoonie lets out a soft bark, looking up at me, his eyes filled with trust. I give him a shaky smile, nodding. "Let's go, boy. Let's end this." And with that, I step out of the car, the wind whipping through my hair, and begin unloading the small boat I'd brought along. Spoonie jumps out after me, sniffing the air, his eyes scanning the horizon. The island looms in the distance, a dark silhouette against the gray sky, the trees swaying as if they're alive, reaching for something. The waves are rougher today, crashing against the rocky shoreline, and for a moment, I hesitate. But the feeling of those eyes watching me, the constant sense of dread, pushes me forward. I know that if I don't do this, if I don't face whatever it is that's out there, I'll never be free. So with a deep breath, I push the boat into the water, Spoonie hopping in first, and we set off. The journey across feels longer this time. The waves slap against the sides of the boat, each crash sending a spray of cold water over us. Spoonie's normally eager eyes are focused on the island, his ears up, every muscle in his body tense. He knows what we're going back to. As we approach the shore, the wind seems to grow louder, like a whisper that's turned into a wail, and I feel that familiar chill settle into my bones. The island is just as I remember it. Wild, untamed, the rocky cliffs rising up along one side, the dark woods pressing in from the other. I pull the boat ashore, securing it to a large rock, and we step out onto the beach. The air is heavy, thick with tension. There's no sound of birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the wind and the steady crashing of waves against the rocks. Spoonie stays close to my side, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows, his nose twitching as if he's trying to catch a scent. I don't have a plan, not really. I just know I have to go back to the place where it all started, the campsite by the cliffs. My footsteps crunch against the gravel as we make our way through the trees, the narrow trail twisting and turning, the branches overhead forming a dark canopy that blocks out most of the daylight. Every step feels heavier, like something is trying to hold me back, trying to keep me from getting closer. Spoonie stops suddenly, his body going rigid, a low growl rumbling in his throat. I look up, my heart pounding, and I see it. Just ahead, in the clearing by the cliffs, that same figure. It's standing by where the campfire had been, facing away from me, perfectly still. The sight of it makes my blood run cold, my body frozen with fear. I take a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Hey!" I shout, my voice cracking slightly, carried away by the wind. The figure doesn't move. It just stands there, its back to me, its head slightly bowed, as if it's waiting for something. Spoonie lets out a bark, and I can feel his tension, his fear matching my own. Slowly, I take a step forward, my legs trembling. The air around us seems to grow colder, the wind dying down until everything is unnaturally silent. My breath is loud in my ears, my heartbeat echoing in the stillness. I take another step, and then another, until I'm just a few feet away from it. "Why are you here?" I manage to say, my voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you want?" The figure doesn't respond, but slowly it begins to turn. My breath catches in my throat as I see its face, or what should be a face. Instead, it's just shadow, dark and empty, a void where features should be. My stomach twists in fear, and I stumble back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and falling to the ground with a soft thud. The figure steps forward, moving with an unnatural fluidity, and Spoonie lunges, barking and growling, placing himself between me and whatever this thing is. The figure stops, its head tilting slightly, as if studying Spoonie, considering him. I scramble to pick up the flashlight, my hands shaking, and shine the beam directly at it. For a moment, the light seems to cut through the shadows, and I see something, an expression, a flicker of sadness, or maybe regret. But then the darkness closes in again, swallowing it up, and I feel a cold wind rush past me, as if something is moving through me, into me. I gasp, stumbling backward, the air around me feeling heavy, pressing down on my chest. I look up, and the figure is gone. Just like that, disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the sound of the waves crashing below and the wind rustling through the trees. Spoonie is still barking, his eyes darting around, looking for the thing that has vanished. I fall to my knees, my body trembling, the flashlight beam shaking as I try to catch my breath. What was that? What did it want? The sadness I'd seen in that fleeting moment, it didn't make sense. Why had it followed me? Why was it here? Spoonie whines, nudging my arm, and I look down at him, his eyes filled with worry. I take a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and pull him close, burying my face in his fur. I feel tears welling up, not just from fear, but from exhaustion, from the sheer weight of everything that's happened. And that's when I realize, this isn't about fighting it. This isn't about winning. It's about understanding, about accepting whatever it is that's here, whatever it wants. Maybe the island isn't haunted by something evil. Maybe it's haunted by something lost, something that's searching for peace, for release. Slowly, I get to my feet, Spoonie still by my side, and I make my way back to where the fire had been. The air feels different now, less heavy, less oppressive. I kneel down, gathering some dry branches, my hands steadying as I work. I strike a match, the flame flickering before catching, the warmth spreading as the fire begins to grow. I sit there, watching the flames, Spoonie lying beside me, his head on my knee. The light dances across the clearing, pushing back the shadows, and for the first time since I arrived on this island, I feel a sense of calm. I don't know what will happen next, but I know that running won't solve anything. Whatever this thing is, it's tied to this place, and maybe, just maybe, it's not trying to hurt me. Maybe it's just trying to be seen, to be remembered. Hours pass, the fire crackling softly, the sky slowly brightening as dawn begins to break. I sit there, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, Spoonie asleep beside me. The fear that had gripped me for so long seems to fade with the night, replaced by a quiet resolve. As the first rays of sunlight break through the trees, I feel it. A presence, a warmth, almost like a whisper in the wind. I look up, and for just a moment I see it again, the figure standing at the edge of the clearing. But this time, it feels different. It's not watching in the same way. There's no malice, no threat, just a quiet stillness, a sense of something that's been waiting for a long time. I raise my hand, a small wave, and the figure tilts its head as if acknowledging me. Then slowly, it begins to fade, the shadows lifting, the light of the morning sun washing over the clearing, until there's nothing left but the trees and the sound of the waves far below. I sit there for a while longer, the fire dying down, the warmth of the sun finally cutting through the chill. Spoonie wakes, stretching and yawning, his tail thumping against the ground. I smile, scratching behind his ears, and look out at the woods around us. It feels different now, less haunted, more peaceful. I don't know if I'll ever truly understand what happened on that island. Maybe it was just my imagination, a trick of the shadows, the product of my own fears. Or maybe there really was something here, something that had been waiting for someone to see it, to acknowledge it, to let it go. Either way, as I pack up my things and make my way back to the boat, Spoonie trotting beside me, I feel lighter. The island seems quieter now, the wind gentler, the shadows less threatening. And as I push off from the shore, the waves carrying us away, I look back one last time, the cliffs rising above the trees, and I feel a strange sense of closure. Whatever it was, whatever watched me from the darkness, it's at peace now. And maybe, just maybe, I am too. You know, I've told this story a few times now, but it never gets any easier. Maybe it's because every time I think back to that night, I still get chills. It's funny how certain moments in life just stick with you, like they're etched into your bones. I guess this is one of those moments. But here goes nothing. It was one of those nights in early autumn. You know, the kind when the air's getting crisp and everything just smells like pine needles and damp earth. The kind of night that's quiet, too quiet, when you're out in the middle of nowhere. That's where we were, my buddy Mike and I, camping out in the state forest. We'd pitched our tent at a little clearing just off a dirt road, far enough from the highway that we wouldn't hear any cars, but close enough to know we could make a quick escape if we needed to. Around us, the air was cold and still. Not just cold in the grab-your-jacket sense, more like the kind of cold that seems to seep into your skin, settling into your bones, and it brings a weird silence with it. You could hear a pin drop. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves, an occasional whisper of wind brushing through the tall trees. It was almost peaceful, until it wasn't. My heart was pounding. I was trying to stay calm, trying not to make any sudden noises that might give away where I was. I could feel my chest tighten with every breath, my eyes darting back and forth, scanning the darkened woods for any sign of that thing. I don't know if it was an animal or a person, or maybe something worse, but I could feel it, you know? That sense that something's there, just out of sight, lurking. There was nothing. No movement, no flash of eyes reflecting in the moonlight, nothing I could point to and say, yeah, that's it, that's what's scaring me. But that was almost worse. Because when you can't see what you're afraid of, your imagination fills in the blanks. I tried to swallow down the fear as I moved around the campsite, grabbing whatever gear we had left outside. Sleeping bags, a couple of flashlights, the camp stove, all of it needed to go. My hands were shaking, and I was trying to be quick but not loud, glancing over my shoulder every couple of seconds, straining my ears for any hint of footsteps, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. It felt like forever before I got everything stuffed into the back seat in the trunk of the car. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I knew I couldn't stay out here a second longer. I slammed the back door shut, a bit too loud, and that's when I saw it. 2 handprints pressed against the window, smeared like they'd just been made. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my blood run cold. These weren't my handprints or Mike's. These were smaller, almost like a kid's. The prints were faint but unmistakable, fingers spread wide, pressed up against the glass like someone had been trying to look inside. Panic surged through me. I didn't think. I just acted. I wiped them away, my hand trembling as I did it, trying to erase whatever had just happened, as if pretending it didn't exist would somehow make it true. Then I jumped into the front seat, jammed the key into the ignition, and turned it, my foot already pressing on the gas before I even really knew what I was doing. The car lurched forward, tires spitting gravel behind us as I tore away from the campsite. Mike, who'd been dozing off in the passenger seat, jolted awake, his eyes wide with confusion. He mumbled something, asking me what I was doing, but I could barely hear him over the roar of my heartbeat in my ears. "There's someone out there," I managed to say, my voice sounding as shaky as I felt. "We gotta go. Now." Mike rubbed his eyes, trying to wake up fully, and squinted out into the darkness behind us. "Who? What did you see?" I didn't have an answer, because I hadn't seen anything. Not really. Just the prints and the feeling that something was wrong. And that was enough. I drove fast, the tires bouncing and rattling over the uneven dirt road, the car's headlights barely cutting through the thick shadows of the forest. Mike was telling me to slow down, that I was going to hit something if I kept it up, and after a few minutes I finally listened. We reached the highway, the road suddenly widening and smoothing out beneath the tires, and I let myself breathe again. My hands were still white-knuckled around the steering wheel, but I eased off the gas, the speedometer needle drifting back down to something more reasonable. We drove for about 20 miles, neither of us saying much, until we reached a Denny's. The sign's neon glow was like a beacon in the darkness, promising warmth and light and people. Other people, who weren't hiding in the shadows of the woods. Mike asked if we could stop there, grab something to eat, and honestly, I needed a break. I needed to sit somewhere with walls around me and just feel safe. Inside, the place was almost empty. A waitress, probably in her late 50s, with tired eyes and a kind smile, led us to a booth by the window. The lights inside were dim, casting long shadows across the tables, but it was comforting in a way, the normalcy of it all. Mike ordered pancakes, and I just asked for coffee. I couldn't eat. My stomach was still in knots, and my mind was replaying everything, trying to make sense of it. Mike looked at me across the table, his eyes narrowing. "All right, man, spill. What the hell happened back there?" I hesitated. I still felt embarrassed, even sitting there in that booth. Everyone always talks about fight or flight, like those are your only two options. But I didn't do either. I just froze. I sat there, staring at those handprints, and I didn't know what to do. Was it another camper messing with us? Someone living out in that abandoned cabin we saw down the dirt road earlier? Or was it something else? Something that didn't belong? I tried to explain it all to Mike, but the words felt weak, like they couldn't possibly capture the fear I'd felt in that moment. He listened, his fork hovering over his plate, his expression somewhere between concern and disbelief. "You think it was, what, a ghost?" he asked, half joking, but I could hear the unease in his voice. I shrugged, wrapping my hands around my coffee cup, trying to soak in its warmth. "I don't know, man. I just know that it felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there." We didn't talk much after that. I think both of us were trying to process it in our own way. Eventually, we finished up and paid the bill, heading back out to the car. The rest of the drive home was quiet. We didn't go back to that spot for a while after that, and when we did, we stayed close to the highway, always within sight of other people. But, sometimes I think back to those handprints. I wonder if it really was just some other camper playing a trick on us, or if it was something more, something that had been watching us, waiting for us to drift off to sleep, something that pressed its hands against the glass just to let us know it was there. And sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind is rustling the leaves outside, I swear I can still feel it. That presence, just beyond the edge of the light, watching, waiting. And I wonder if one day, it'll come back for me. I don't talk about it much these days, but the night I spent at that cabin still haunts me. I remember every detail vividly. The way the wind howled through the trees like it had something to say, the thick smell of damp wood, and the eerie silence that lingered between each gust. It's funny, you never expect an ordinary weekend trip to turn into something you'll carry with you for the rest of your life. But here I am, still carrying it. It started out like any other trip. A few friends and I had rented a remote cabin in the woods, just for a weekend away from the usual city noise. It was supposed to be relaxing, a little bit of nature, some beer by the fire, maybe some stories to scare each other before we all crashed in our sleeping bags. But as soon as we arrived, I felt something was off. You ever walk into a place and just feel the atmosphere change, like the air gets thicker, heavier? That's what it felt like the moment we stepped out of the car. The cabin itself wasn't anything special. It had the charm you'd expect from a place that hadn't been renovated in probably 30 years. Creaky floorboards, dim lighting, and that strange smell old houses have, like dust and age and maybe a little mildew. We unpacked, settled in, and for the first few hours, things were normal. There was laughter, jokes, beers cracked open, and a fire lit to keep the chill at bay. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees, and for a brief moment, I let my guard down. It felt peaceful. Almost. But then, night fell. That's when things changed. It was around 9 p.m., I think. The fire was dying down, and the cold was starting to creep in through the cracks of the old cabin. One of my friends, Pete, had wandered off to the edge of the property to collect more wood for the fire. He'd been gone for a while, too long, actually, so I decided to go check on him. It wasn't like Pete to get distracted, especially in the dark. I grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The woods, now completely shrouded in darkness, felt claustrophobic. The trees, which earlier looked so peaceful, now loomed like silent, watchful figures. As I walked toward the edge of the property, the wind picked up again, sending a low, mournful whistle through the branches. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching me. I called out to Pete, no response. I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. My pulse started to quicken. I was about to turn back, figuring he'd probably just gone off for a piss or something, when I saw it. A faint, flickering light deep in the woods, like the beam of a flashlight, but it was moving strangely. It wasn't steady, like someone walking with it. It was jerky, almost frantic. "Pete?" I called out again, my voice trembling just slightly. I wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. No answer. I hesitated, then started toward the light. The further I walked, the more the trees closed in around me. The crunch of leaves beneath my boots seemed deafening in the quiet, each step echoing like a gunshot in the stillness of the forest. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that Pete was probably just messing with me, trying to freak me out. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then, the light disappeared. I stopped in my tracks, my breath hanging in the air, frozen and sharp. The woods were suddenly suffocatingly silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, just nothing. It was as if the entire world had stopped, waiting for something. "Pete," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Still nothing. I scanned the area with my flashlight, sweeping it across the dense trees, and then I saw it. Something moved, just at the edge of the beam. A shadow, too tall to be Pete, too thin to be human. It was there for a split second, and then it was gone. My heart slammed against my rib cage as I stumbled backward, almost dropping the flashlight. I turned to run back to the cabin, but before I could take more than a few steps, I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching through the underbrush behind me. They weren't fast, but they were steady. They were following me. Panic surged through me, adrenaline flooding my veins as I sprinted back toward the cabin. The footsteps followed, matching my pace. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to get inside, to get to the others, to get away from whatever was out there. I reached the cabin door and slammed it behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My friends looked up, startled by the noise. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because they immediately crowded around, asking what had happened. I don't know, I stammered. Something's out there. I saw something. They didn't believe me at first, of course. They laughed it off, said I was probably just spooked by the dark, by the woods. But then, we all heard it, scratching. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the back door. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, staring at the door, the scratching growing more frantic, more desperate. Then there was a loud bang, like something heavy had slammed into the door. That was enough to send us all into a panic. We barricaded the door with whatever we could find, chairs, the table, anything to keep whatever was out there from getting in. The next few hours were the longest of my life. We huddled together in the center of the cabin, our backs to the wall, flashlights in hand, waiting. The scratching continued for what felt like an eternity, followed by more banging, more sounds of something, or someone, trying to force their way in. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and one by one, we fell asleep, except for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was still watching, waiting. When morning finally came, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the trees like a lifeline, we cautiously unbarricaded the door and stepped outside. There were no signs of anything unusual, no footprints, no scratches, no damage to the door. It was as if the entire night had been a nightmare, a figment of our collective imagination. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. We left that cabin as fast as we could, throwing our bags into the car and speeding down the dirt road without looking back. None of us have spoken about that night since. It's like an unspoken pact, a shared trauma we've all agreed to bury. But every once in a while, when I'm lying in bed at night, I'll hear that sound, the scratching at the door. And I wonder if one day, whatever it was will find me again, because I don't think it ever will.